death. It is only a transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She is a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane.
Hi, and welcome to episode 93 of the Talking to the Dead podcast. I hope you all had a nice Easter, and I took a week off because I went off to Berlin. And I had an episode in mind that I wanted to do, but I knew more would come to me in the week that I spent in Berlin and then coming back to Cologne. And of course, as usual, that is exactly what happened. Briefly, when I was in Berlin, I ended up going to see a concert with my daughter, but we also did quite a lot of tourism, and any form of tourism in Berlin usually involves walking around the memorials. As David Bowie said in his song, Where Are We Now? It's all about walking the dead, because Berlin is, certainly in the center of town, is really just one great big memorial to the dead, whether it's from the Nazi past and the murdered Jews, or all the various other people who escaped or didn't escape, got shot trying to climb over the Berlin Wall, etc., etc. But what's important about Berlin is if you go to the East Side Gallery, which is not a gallery, it's just a park, and it's near the Uber Eats stadium where I went. It's a very interesting place because it's one of the very last stretches of the Berlin Wall left standing. It's almost a kilometer long, and it's on one side completely decorated with the mosaics of graffiti that were famous from those who lived on the west side of the wall. And on the east side of the wall, it's all still pretty anonymous, but leading to a park and then to a river. And obviously all of that was impossible to pass from the people on the east side. But what was important to be at the Berlin Wall was I got the tremendous sense of old alternative Berlin as it was. And I also went to see Hansa Studios near Potsdamer Platz, where David Bowie and Iggy Pop and many people in that time of the Berlin Wall recorded their famous albums, like Station to Station and Low and all that stuff. And it was in an area which is very, very alternative. It leads eventually up to Kreuzberg, and it's all gone now. I mean, now it's just skyscrapers, it's sports cars, and it's very expensive apartments. But certainly in the 70s, Berlin was the ultimate in alternative fun. And what I really want to talk about this week is one of the pioneers of alternative music, but only because he is also ultimately incredibly involved with psychic phenomena, the occult, the dead, and everything else, so it fits in perfectly. His name is Genesis P-Orridge, and he had a very interesting background, which I'll go to in a little bit more detail. But how does that relate to Cologne? Well, I'm standing here now in what's called the Südbahnhof Viertel. It's quite an alternative part of Cologne. It's probably just as it used to look around Kreuzberg in Berlin. We haven't been quite so industrialized and taken over by the rich here in Cologne as they have in Berlin. And around this particular area, there are still tremendous amounts of clubs and bars, and it's still an extremely alternative place. I mean, you can see the graffiti all over the walls. And I'm walking down Luxembourg Strasse at the moment, and there's just club after club with stickers on the walls, graffiti, and I'm stopping right now outside the club Luxor, which is aptly named, very Egyptian. And this is probably the last place, I think, in 2016 that Genesis P-Orridge's final band, which was called Psychick TV, did their industrial psychic music concert. So I felt, again, very drawn to come here. There's really absolutely no point because I can't get in or anything, but it's quite nice to feel that energy and know that this is where he was. And if you carry on walking past it down towards other clubs like the Blue Shell, that's the Stereo, Wonderland, Fiedel Club, Schnell, Stiegel. Eventually you get onto a bunch of roads that come off Luxemburger Strasse, and they all lead to clubs and bars, and it's all feeling quite industrial here, and probably the perfect place to do something like his type of music. So as I stand here on Hochstadenstrasse and look down, I'm sure nothing much has changed since 2016. Now, this chap, Genesis P-Orridge, who later on in life became identified as a female, apart from anything else, he was a very interesting guy. As I said, we'll talk about him shortly. But he died in March 2020, only a couple of months after Neil Peart, who died in January 2020. And when I was doing an episode on the very important influence of Aleister Crowley on music and art, and the incredible influence that the occult and magic and psychic stuff and consciousness has had on music in general, from just thinking of the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, of course. Genesis Breyer was also involved with bands like Psychick Youth and Throbbing Gristle. And he was a tremendous musician who felt that he could synthesize probably contact with the devil, but also maybe consciousness and being able to make things happen through consciousness, through music and art. And he was synthesizing all of that with his increasingly out there philosophy. So, why am I here? Well, because I think Genesis Breyer at some point in the last couple of weeks came through to me for some reason. Now, I had been thinking about him, and I think I'd even mentioned him in a previous episode, and I was fascinated by him, but for some reason I never got around to it. I kind of almost forgot about it. But when I've been studying more and more the importance of consciousness and the fact that everything we do is created by our consciousness, and that consciousness is the backbone of all reality and all levels of reality, whether it's what happens to us when we die or potentially what happens if other species, intelligent species, are visiting us from other dimensions and they're contacting us through consciousness. It all comes together with this idea that there were people who were trying to make that more accessible, and obviously people like Crowley with his Thelema have made it all pretty inaccessible, and there are not many people who've tried to really make the sort of psychic stuff accessible and allow people to get in touch with other beings or the other consciousnesses. Now this guy, Genesis Breyer, thought he could try to do that for the average young guy, and he could do it through his music, he could do it through psychedelic performances. But I was very interested in that, but here finally got a chance to do a longish episode, quite a lot of talking. I hope you'll enjoy it, because I think he's actually very, very important, and I think what he was trying to say is very relevant. Yes, he was out there. He was probably taking a little bit too much LSD. He was in terrible trouble with the law most of the time because of his what was considered at the time very profane musical lyrics and the messages that he was putting into his music, and certainly the cultural elite at the time, the cultural Nazis of the time, did their best to stop him from performing and saying what he wanted to say. Always a very good indication that he must have been speaking some truth. So, I want to begin talking to you about Psychick TV, because without understanding what Psychick TV was and what it was attempting to do, everything else, things like the rituals they did, their writings, and their really seminal book called the Psychick or Psychick Bible would remain incomplete. So I've now managed to find a reasonably quiet park called the Volksgarten. It's really very lovely. I've cycled through here before but never had a chance to sit here, and I'm sitting under a tree. I feel at peace, and I think this is a very good place to be, and I have a very strong feeling that Genesis P-Orridge and his friends came here to sit and to play. It's not far from where they were performing, and is again part of the alternative culture of Cologne. So a nice place to be. Psychick TV was not formed simply as a continuation of the music that they'd created already with the band Throbbing Gristle. It was something very deliberate. It was more constructed, and it was in many ways an attempt by Genesis P-Orridge. Actually, his full name was Genesis Breyer P-Orridge, and he wanted to take the ideas that he'd explored through confrontation and turn them into something very immersive, something that could be experienced and entered, internalized. And P-Orridge was moving towards not just a form of new artistic expression, but also a way of using that artistic expression in an application sort of way. And this is what's fascinating to me, is because as I have found doing this podcast for nearly 3 years, music and art are completely integral in the way that psychic behavior works. And whether you're interested in the meanings of music, or the way that music can help you transcend to other dimensions, or whether you're interested in using the rhythms and the drums and the beats, as perhaps Neil Peart was, in order to create an atmosphere that could almost lead to a form of hypnosis, perhaps, or a transcendental state that could allow you to enter new realities. Whatever it was, P-Orridge was most definitely one of the pioneers trying to use music and a band as a vehicle through sound, repetition and imagery to alter people's perception. And there was a very specific belief that he had, and it was controlled and guided and influenced by these sensory experiences that he created with the music. P-Orridge's involvement with what you might call magic, which was not magic in the real sense, really. It was more theatrical. Some people call it chaos magic, and we have discussed that before. But it's an idea that it's a tool, the symbols, and when they're combined with somebody's intention or some form of tremendous emotional intensity, it can reshape the way reality is perceived and interacted with. Psychick TV became really one of the primary vehicles for that, and it's a kind of a practice that people got involved in, and they became very famous, and their performances were not designed as concerts in the traditional sense. They were structured more like rituals, and though rarely described in those terms publicly. The sound would repeat. There are many examples of the music that you can go and listen to on YouTube if you like. Patterns would build. Visual elements would reinforce these symbolic motifs, and the audience would be drawn into a shared alternate state. There is a cumulative effect that happens with repetition, especially when combined with rhythm and volume, and that's why it's been so popular in popular music. But the analytical mind begins to step back at that point, and something more instinctive takes over. And it's not accidental. It's the same principle that's used in rituals across multiple traditions. Repetition as a means of shifting consciousness. It's used not just in the magic of Aleister Crowley or anyone like that. It's not just the magic that's used in the Catholic and the Protestant churches. They use music, they use repetition, they use prayer. It's all the same. It was discovered many, many thousands of years that you could get your mind into an altered state of consciousness using these tools. Now, the temple, as it was called, of Psychick Youth, were encouraged to perform private rituals, often involving sigils and using intention and focused states of awareness. And Psychic TV functioned as his public outside shop window, if you like, to all the private work that he was doing behind the scenes. It created an environment where similar processes could occur collectively. And what I find very significant about P-Orridge is that he didn't separate these. There was no clear boundary between his music. Sound was not just an aesthetic, it was functional. The frequency, the pattern, the repeated structures, they were capable of influencing people's internal states. There was also a real emphasis on transmission. And P-Orridge often spoke about ideas as signals and something that can be broadcast and received and modified. And in this framework, Psychic TV became less of a band and more of a transmitter. The music, like all music that I have found, carries so much more than just sound. It carries intention. It carries symbolic content. It has embedded ideas, and if you're really lucky, it can connect you through timeless distances between different consciousnesses. It also enables you to go interdimensional, as I have found, and I'm sure you have found, that when you listen to music that you'd heard in your youth, it takes you back immediately to that point. It does something to your brain that makes its consciousness alert to those memories and feelings. More importantly, you can actually get that same feeling that you had at that moment, perhaps when you heard that music, and it can elicit the same emotions that perhaps you were feeling at the time. Now, whether or not you accept that it has an external effect beyond perhaps psychology, what's clear is that there is an internal effect, and it changes how people feel, it changes how people think, and how they relate to themselves and their surroundings. And that in itself is a tremendous form of influence. As Psychic TV evolved, particularly in the late 1980s, their movement into electronic music and early rave culture expanded this effect and had a tremendous effect on people, and rave became huge. I never actually went to rave and never was particularly into rave, but I know many people who were, and people would do this for days, listening to repetitive beats. There were this feeling of being in a collective movement, and all of these elements were there to amplify altered states, obviously with the help of a tremendous amount of psychoactive and psychedelic drugs. But what had been once more of a contained experimental environment for P-Orridge and his friends, and also the practitioners of occult magic, became much larger, much more accessible. But the underlying structure remained just the same. It was all about repetition, immersion, and changing the state of consciousness. And what P-Orridge was attempting, as I understand it, was to create this bridge between internal experience and external real form, between private intention and shared reality, between what we might call the psychological and what has traditionally been called the magic. I saw an interview with him, and he was talking about the importance of trying to break down the barrier between the band playing and the people listening. And it was something that, of course, Roger Waters in Pink Floyd talked about extensively in the 1970s and inspired him to write Pink Floyd's seminal album, The Wall, because he believed that there was a wall between him and the band, and I suppose between him and the audience. Now his was a rather complicated psychiatric issue as well, I think, revolving around tremendous personal loss through the death of his father and the effect of growing up as a child, a single child with a mother during the war, and also the effect of various other individuals and experiences on his life. But most interesting, of course, it's this idea that Psychick TV was trying to break down that wall between an artist and his listener. And whatever you watch on TV or whatever concerts you go to, you often hear of people talking about trying to involve the audience, and to whether it's having the fourth wall where you talk directly to the audience, or whether you have music that's increasingly like modern concerts being performed in the round with the audience all around it, or even as I've seen with bands like Coldplay, where they actually have pop-up stages right in the middle of all the audiences. So it's a wonderful idea to try to get people involved. Now, when I consider this in the broader context of his seminal book, the Psychick Bible, the Temple of Psychick Youth, which was the sort of group that he created, and their emphasis on signs and symbolic systems, I can see how the Psychick TV was a kind of amplifier. It was a way of scaling up his individual practices into a collective experience. And it had a tremendous effect, as all rock music has had, on generations of people. And the sigils, the combination of art, music, words, is something that is the backbone, as I've mentioned before, of all modern music and cultural influence on young people. So it's been extremely powerful and a very effective way to get information amplified and transmitted to people. I would say that's a form of magic. Psychology is magic, but what matters was that it was quite intentional. And this is really where the next part of my story takes up. And up to this point, I've just really described some of the systems and the outcomes, but not the individuals who built them. And it's very important to learn about the people. And the central figure is, of course, this Genesis Breyer P-Orridge. And he was born as just an ordinary Neil Andrew Megson in Manchester in 1950. And he was part of Britain, which was still structured by a very rigid class system, very conservative morality, and a deeply embedded institutional authority. And from an early stage, he and others began to feel a resistance and wanting to make something of themselves and break away from that. And of course, in the 70s, that was very, very popular with the punk movement and bands like the Sex Pistols. But Orridge's later work cannot be understood as rebellion alone. It's not just reactive, it's also constructive. And it was seeking to replace existing systems with an alternative one. Now, he had a very important stage in the late 60s where he founded something called Coombe Transmissions alongside Cosi Fanny Tutti, and Coombe began as a performance art collective, but quickly evolved into something far more. Their work, which is interesting to hear this, became very, very similar to perhaps some form of occult ritual. It incorporated bodily fluids, sexual imagery, self-harm, deliberate violations of social taboo. It was not just provocation like the punk movement. It was a direct confrontation with what they viewed as the hidden mechanisms of control within society. and particularly the ways in which sexuality, shame, and violence were suppressed, but it also simultaneously exploited in the media and institutions. And there was an exhibition in 1976, and it was called Prostitution, and it was at London's Institute of Contemporary Arts, and it became a flashpoint. It led to public outrage and even talked about in Parliament and with tabloid hysteria. And the COOM members were labelled wreckers of civilization. But it had revealed the boundaries that are not always visible. Now, COOM emerged as one of the most influential and disruptive musical projects of the 20th century. Then came Throbbing Gristle, and it was formed with Cosi Fanny Tutti, Peter Christopherson, and Chris Carter. And Throbbing Gristle didn't approach music as composition in the traditional sense. They approached it as information warfare. Their sound was really abrasive and repetitive and often deliberately uncomfortable. And when I listen to it, it's almost something that you can't listen to for very long. It really does hurt. It was made from tape loops and synthesized noises and distorted vocals and sounds that they'd found. There weren't traditional melodies. There was nothing to make you feel comfortable in a structure. There was just this immersion, and it was not supposed to be entertainment. It was supposed to be disruption. It was trying to force audiences to confront material that mainstream culture had somehow taken and sanitized. There were often references to fascism or serial killers or pornography and surveillance. It's probably the precursor to things like drill rap and the rap movements that we know more about now. And it's quite interesting that it was even only just yesterday that Kanye West, or Ye as he's called now, has been banned from England for his music and what he's talking about. And a festival called the Wireless Festival that was supposed to take place in July this year has been abandoned and cancelled because all the sort of very conservative sponsors like PayPal and Vodafone, I think, have all pulled out because of Kanye West and because he is using his media platform to shock and to enrage and to do what he's always done to get an audience. And he starts likening the situation with the Jewish people and the Holocaust to what's going on in Israel and Palestine now. And he wrote a suitably provocative song called Heil Hitler, and another one called Gas Chambers. So he has kind of brought it on himself in this cancel cultural world that we live in. But also, yes, it's appropriately shocking. It's designed to shock. I have no doubt that he's not an anti-Semite or a Nazi at all. He's just an extremely shrewd and clever man who uses shock as a way of getting his message through. Now, that's just the modern version of what was happening with Throbbing Gristle back in the 70s and the 80s. It's very important that when Throbbing Gristle was dissolved, many of the ideas presented were taken along and kept and returned by P-Orridge when they formed Psychick TV. And Psychick TV was both a band and an extension of the Temple of Psychick Youth's ideology. And it moved fluidly between genres, including ambient music, experimental pop, and eventually what became known as acid house. But this shift was not accidental. In the 1980s, when it came out, rave culture was huge, and this mass participation environment structured around rhythm and repetition and shared emotional intensity was something that had become a cultural phenomenon. And Cosi Fanny Tutti, her role is sometimes under-examined, but she has her own body and of work, and she was a medium, and she tried to help people understand that sexuality was not identity, but as an interface, a point of interaction between an individual and a system. And Chris Carter, the fourth member of Throbbing Gristle, he was a guy who contributed a lot of technical precision that grounded the project. He was also very involved in the theoretical aspects of the project. And together, they formed a convergence point of art, music, design, sexuality, and occult theory. This theory emerged both as the Psychick Bible and the operational structure of the Temple of Psychick Youth. Now, this brings me back to the present, because when I look at contemporary culture and the integration of identity in media and symbolism and network communication, I don't see this as an isolated development. This was a trajectory that was shaped in part by these individuals who created culture as a system to be engineered and were willing to experiment radically. But what I want to talk about is an understanding about the Psychick Bible. Now, you can get that online. It's very detailed. It's not like a religious document. It's like reading a manual. It presents itself as a very loose compilation of ritual instructions, essays, fragments of correspondence, but beneath the surface is a consistent logic. It draws heavily from chaos magic, which treats belief itself as something to be adapted and used or discarded as needed. There is no requirement for faith in the traditional sense. There is just participation. Now, the rituals described, most notably the monthly sigil practices, are structured around the idea that desire can be encoded symbolically, intensified emotionally, and then released into a broader network. Now, the idea is that you can make your thoughts create reality, which is the basis of all reality. To give you an example of how it's done, and it's worth probably trying if you're interested, because, as I said, there's nothing evil in this. This is nothing that should be against anybody's moral beliefs or religious beliefs. But basically what they did was that they would write down all the thoughts that they had of what they wanted. So suppose, just for the sake of argument, you want to be able to get tickets to see your favorite band, Coldplay. Well, what you do is you write down all the things about Coldplay and all the things that you really want to see about Coldplay, why it's so important to you to see them, and how you would feel, all of that. And then what you're supposed to do is to take those words and cross out every single, so keep it short, cross out every single letter that repeats until you just get a bunch of letters that represent your thoughts. And these letters should be pretty unique. And then you probably then combine those into a pattern or a picture or some sort of sign that represents your thought. The next important part of that is once you've got that, and that represents that desire of yours to see Coldplay, you have to imbue it with emotional intensity. You've got to charge it up like a battery. You've got to give it something that really represents your real desire. And you can do that through various things such as meditation. Obviously, if you are a follower of the Psychick Youth, and you would probably use everything from sex to drugs to chanting to listening to music, all the things that you might traditionally do to get yourself into a very heightened sense of emotional awareness. And you imbue that with this sigil. You make sure that this sigil is part of you for a while, and keep it around you for a while. Maybe do all these things for a week or so. Then the most important thing after that is that you put it away. You don't destroy it, but you don't have it with you anymore, and you don't think about it anymore. It moves subtly, therefore, from your consciousness to your subconsciousness, and you let your subconscious work on it, and that apparently is where things really start manifesting. And of course, that's the basis of magic. It's the basis of making things come true. It's the basis of summoning, whether it's the CE5 protocols to summon interdimensional beings, or whether it's prayer, or whether it's just magic. That is the basis of creating what you want. So you just forget it, you don't think about it anymore, you just let your subconscious do the work. And I presume in time, for whatever reason, somebody's going to offer you Coldplay tickets, or something along those lines. There'll usually be some amazing coincidence, or something will happen that will enable you to connect to that possibility and turn it into a reality. Now, for his people to be able to get what they wanted and to create intentional, emotional feelings, and very intense ones, you had to do things to be shocking. And it's not surprising, therefore, that he and others try to shock and try to create a tremendous emotional response to things, just as Kanye West is doing right now. And again, I don't want to necessarily use Kanye West as some form of role model, which I don't think he is, but without doubt he's probably the most famous person at the moment that has used his obvious musical talents in a way that has completely shocked and caused the Jewish people to be outraged, and for the United Kingdom government to even ban him from the country. So there's a huge amount of emotion and value to him created by that. And if you look at contemporary advertising, you see the same. It's a normalization of shocking imagery, symbolic layering, things that they sometimes call hidden meanings, or even just sort of meanings in plain sight. I mean, if whatever you see now on the internet when you're browsing, you see really rather horrible photographs that get your attention. I think they call it clickbait. I mean, these things draw you in. They hit you on an emotional level, which might be killing, or it may be accidents, it may be diseases, it may be shocking, unreal photos of famous people doing things that you can't believe, whatever it may be. And of course, so much of it now is faked by AI, so you don't really know what to believe anymore. But this has the same effect. It gets you into an emotional state, but is allowing you to get drawn into their advertising, and hopefully they expect to be able to sell it to you. And it's exactly the basis of the algorithms of social media that draw increasingly young people in to a world which is quite dark usually, and quite troubling, and has only one purpose, which is to make money for these organizations such as Facebook or TikTok or Instagram. So that is the relevance of P-Orridge and the Temple of Psychic Youth to the modern world. And it's fascinating to think that he was really one of the founders of it, even though you probably may never have heard his name until today. His work has enabled modern advertising to be what it is. Now, how does this all fit in with UFOs and extraterrestrials? Well, very much so, because if you think of Jacques Vallée, the famous UFO scientist, he feels, and I've discussed this before, that UFO phenomena functions probably less in a physical sense and more in a sense of the influence on human perception and belief. there is this hypothesis that treats that it might not be reality. It may be more you're looking at something and imagining things, and that perhaps when you're getting involved with interdimensional beings or UFOs, it's more symbolic, and the experiences may be more in your mind than actually physically seeing objects. Now, obviously, without doubt, there are people who are seeing objects and are seeing UFOs and seeing things, and things have crashed, and it's known that the American government has these vehicles and have been reverse engineering them for years. So there is that side of it, but there is, without doubt, and particularly if you watch the new documentary on Amazon about, quite interesting, about Bob Lazar, the guy who allegedly worked on a very secret base called S4 near Area 51, and he is famous in UFO lore for coming out and basically being a whistleblower and saying that he worked on these spacecraft in American facilities, and he went to tremendous lengths to describe what they look like, their propulsion systems, and even went as far as describing, although he hadn't seen them, that they had found and recovered bodies of extraterrestrials and what they looked like. But more interestingly, he actually went into one of these recovered UFOs, and they were very small on the inside, as if the little chairs were designed for children. Everything was very small, and there was no control mechanisms. There were just 3 chairs. There was a sort of a wave amplifier and various pieces of machinery connected to some form of reactor which used a particular element that doesn't exist on Earth. And there was this feeling that the beings connected psychically with the machine that they were flying, and they could make the walls become translucent by thought. They could steer, they could do everything just through touch and thought. And of course, the American government have found that incredibly hard to back engineer, because although they have obviously spent millions and millions trying to create psychics who can interact with these vehicles, I'm not sure, maybe it's going to be revealed just how much luck they've had. There is some indication that they have been able to do it, and they can actually fly these vehicles, but I'm not terribly sure. Now, all of this relates again to the Psychick Bible and this idea that the world works on symbolism. It works on the ability to control through your mind, and you cannot see anything real that you've not thought of or created yourself, or through group consciousness. Now, the ideas in the Psychick Bible of using symbol and repetition and network are very important to this point, because from that perspective, consciousness is no longer confined to a person's mind. It's all outside the mind. And if you are able to want something, if you perceive something, you can have an effect on biology. And it's something that can help you understand that there is proof of life after death, because you can demonstrate that consciousness is not entirely private within your head. It's something you participate in. It's something that is all around us, and we are, if you like, just containers of consciousness. And as much as those people who are coming from other dimensions, or maybe from other galaxies that are millions of years ahead of us, they've mastered the ability to use consciousness and to use the mind to control everything. And we're obviously just at the very beginning of understanding that process. But there is a direct parallel with religion. And because in religion, there are aspects that are used, symbols, intentions. So it's very similar to religion, and it's interesting to think that maybe thousands of years ago we were closer to understanding how the mind worked and how we influence things through our mind and consciousness than we are now. It may well be that we've lost that, maybe deliberately, or maybe there were prior civilizations very, very much more advanced than us that we have no longer any contact with and we don't even know ever existed. Or maybe the technology was somehow lost. But most certainly, if you look in ancient writings and ancient buildings and temples, there are huge amounts of symbols, and the ideas are just as powerful there as anything that we could be creating right now. If you look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics, for instance, yes, they tell a story, but it's more than just a story. It's an intention of something to happen. Usually these stories are revolving around death or life after death, and they're engaging you to look at something like a movie, to bring you along, to help you understand how the Egyptians saw reality, and that by actually thinking about it and drawing it on the walls, they were somehow helping the person who had died reach that next dimension. It was a very powerful thought that they used art, and for all we know, we have no knowledge, but for all we know, they used music and they used repetition and all the things that Psychick Youth and Psychic TV, Throbbing Gristle, all these people used in order to activate occult things. So this is why it makes the boundary between life and death less absolute. It's more permeable. And this is why the Psychick Bible and P-Orridge and his various bands matter so much in this context. And not just because it proves that there could be survival, but because it forces us to consider what survival might mean. It shows that consciousness is what survives. Our life, when it ends, is not a conclusion. Now, I know many of you listening have just come through the 8th of April, like me, wondering what Donald Trump was going to do in Iran, and he sent some really rather horrifying messages on his Truth Social about technically, I think, eliminating Iran. And I suppose the only way of doing that is with some advanced weapon, such as a nuclear weapon. Thank God he didn't do it, and this morning we all wake up and he's put a truce in place, although the Iranians are playing a very silly game of taunting him, and which is not a good idea, because I think however you can politely describe Donald Trump, he is not a person who likes to be teased, and he doesn't like to be taunted, and he doesn't like people to say he's lost or he's wrong. Well, Iran are certainly not doing a very good job at trying to make peace if they keep taunting him, because he is liable to do something which would be unthinkable. We managed to dodge that bullet last night, much as we did, I think, a couple of years ago when I had that tremendous sense that things were rapidly going wrong, and it really affected me on a psychic level, and it was as if I was being psychically attacked. You might go back and listen to those episodes. Well, the same thing has happened in this last week, and I just wanted to end on that note. I haven't felt that same sense that it's going to happen this time. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is, as they're calling him, Taco, which is short of, Trump always chickens out, Taco, which is what they're calling him. Thank God he has chickened out. I have no problem with that. But what is worrying is that he always wants to take things up to the brink. And, he's painting himself into a corner, and all of us into a corner, that could mean that something really unthinkable happens, like the detonation of a nuclear device. And what would that potentially lead to? Now, I hope, in a way, if something unthinkable like that happens, it happens in a desert area where the most minimal of casualties will occur, but the most maximal effect will also take place that will force, much as happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the crazy leadership of Iran to stop. But, talking to my wife and other friends, I don't think they are the sort of people that will stop at that. I don't think death is a worry to them. I think they see it as martyrdom. And I'm not sure that they wouldn't mind sacrificing the whole of Iran for that. Even though they only represent, I understand, about 20% of the Iranian people. The Iranian Guard and all of those people who run the country are fanatic about their beliefs and should not be taken lightly. I wish you all well. I do hope that when I do my next podcast soon, we'll all be in a slightly better state and that the whole thing will be over. Already there is a sense that the oil price will drop and that people are standing down and maybe the missiles will stop and maybe we can return to some sense of normality. But also, we have to ask the Iranian people not to be so proud in this and also to back down. No, they don't have to give up everything. Doesn't have to be any more regime change, but for goodness sake, you don't want to be saying you've got a nuclear device and you want to be blowing up Israel or America anymore. You really don't want to be doing that. So thank you very much. Until next time, from the center of Cologne in the beautiful Volksgarten, on a lovely sunny day, blue sky, not a cloud in the sky, about 20 degrees centigrade. Summer is here at last. Life is good. What I created seems to be pretty good, and what you create, I hope, is equally as wonderful for you.